Hi guys, and welcome to this video. This video is really just an introduction into the cranial nerves of the brain and really how we identify them in the cerebrum and the brainstem. So a nice trick that I like to adopt when attempting to identify the cranial nerves is the 2 by 2 by 4 by 4 rule. And what I mean by that when I say that is the first two cranial nerves will stem from the cerebrum. The second two, or the next two, will stem from the midbrain. The following four will stem from the pons, and the four after that will stem from the medulla. So I think this is a pretty good way to go about identifying the first couple of cranial nerves. Once you get down to the medulla and pons, it gets a little confusing, but we'll try to identify them as we go along. So using that principle, our first two are going to come from the cerebrum. So we know our cerebrum is here, 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 and here, looking at it on an inferior surface view. So we know that our first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve, is going to stem somewhere from here. So whereabouts is it? Well, it's actually this right here. So this is our olfactory tract. This runs up and forms this olfactory bulb. And these little small yellow fibers hanging from it are actually the olfactory nerves by themselves. There's about 15 to 20 of those nerves, and as a collective we refer them to as the olfactory nerve. But in a lot of dissections, diagrams, and models that we use in anatomical teaching, a lot of the time they are cut out because of how small they are, so we commonly refer the olfactory bulb as the olfactory nerve, and that's something important to note. So moving on from that, we have our second one coming from the cerebrum, and that will be cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. Okay, and the optic nerve, like all the cranial nerves, stem from either side, so 1 and 2, and these ones are quite easy to see because they're quite large and they form this little crossover down here, what we call the optic chiasm, where it starts to form the optic tract and then continues on to the lateral geniculate nucleus and so forth. So they are our optic nerves, so cranial nerve number 2. So they're our two coming from the cerebrum. So we can see how they come from the cerebrum, 1 and 2 coming off the cerebrum. So we can go ahead and say that we've done those two. Okay, so moving on from that, we now have the next two coming from the midbrain area. And now the midbrain area is quite hard to identify on the inferior surface of the brain like this, and the reason is because, well, it's in the name, it's in the middle of the brain, the midbrain, and like I said, it's quite hard to identify, but some of the cranial nerves coming from there aren't too hard, so let's have a go. So if we zoom in a little bit here and we can see these peduncles at the back, we can pretty much associate them as being quite close to the midbrain. So what cranial nerves are going to come off this area? Well, our first one, which will be cranial nerve number 3, will be the oculomotor nerve. So that is our oculomotor nerve right here. 1, and on the other side, 2, this one. Okay, our oculomotor nerve on either side. Now the next cranial nerve stemming from the midbrain area is the trochlear nerve. Now in a lot of diagrams and anatomical teaching resources, we actually can't identify the trochlear nerve, and the reason is because the trochlear nerve is the only cranial nerve that stems from the posterior view of the brainstem. However, this diagram here actually does a really good job in showing the trochlear nerve, and the reason is because they haven't cut the trochlear nerve like they normally would in the diagrams and models that we learn from. So we can actually see here the trochlear nerve and where it stems around to the back of the brainstem. So our trochlear nerve, whereabouts is it? It is right here. You could say it's located a little inferior to the oculomotor nerve, so it's this one here. And it runs all the way back there, as you can see, and it's the same goes on this side. And maybe if I zoom around, you might be able to see, yes, you can see how it wraps around the back there of the midbrain and stems from the posterior view of the brainstem. So that's quite important. And that's a lot of the time the reason we can't see it. But like I said, this diagram actually does quite well in identifying the trochlear nerve, so we're blessed with that. So moving on from that, we have now done our next two stemming from the midbrain, so we can go ahead and cross those two off as well. So now that we have done that, we can move on to the pons. So the pons is this structure located in the middle, so it's the middle section of the brainstem, and it's normally the largest section of the brainstem and probably the most evident and prominent out of the three. So we know that 4 cranial nerves are going to stem from here. So which ones? Well, the first one is going to be the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve number 5. Now, the trigeminal nerve, unlike any of the others, is the biggest one. And the reason it's the biggest one is because it has 3 divisions that innervate all 3 sections of the face. So whereabouts is the trigeminal? If I just said really basically, it's the biggest nerve or biggest cranial nerve stemming from our brain, where are you going to assume it's going to be? It makes a lot of sense that it's going to be this one right here, or on this side right here. Okay, so our trigeminal nerve is actually the location from here to here, where it stems off the pons, okay? But here, this middle section is what we call the trigeminal ganglion, and then it divides into the 3 divisions that I was talking about before. And those 3 divisions, you can see here. Oops. Just moving back. Those 3 divisions that we can see are the ophthalmic division, being the first one, the second division being the maxillary, and the third one being the mandibular. So that would be my trigeminal nerve, so cranial nerve number 5 on each side. So moving on from that, what comes after trigeminal? So cranial nerve number 6, and that is our abducens. And abducens is quite easy to identify on models like this as well, is because it is the only nerve stemming from the most medial aspect of the brainstem. And that's my abducens nerve there on either side, on the left and right respectively. So that would be my second cranial nerve stemming from the pons, or my 6th cranial nerve altogether. And so we have identified 1 now and 2 stemming from the pons. So where are the other 2? Now the other 2 get a little difficult, and I was talking about this before at the beginning. And the reason they become difficult is because they are located in between the junction between the pons and the medulla, but also because one of the cranial nerves has 2 branches, and they all kind of stem from each other and very close to each other. So if we zoom in here, oops, I've actually clicked on the pons there, but we can see here that we have a lot of nerves running out here. And it is a little confusing at first. But the first thing I want you to do is, well, our nerve that comes next would be cranial nerve number 8. And that will be, number 7, and that will be my facial nerve. And so the facial nerve is the one that stems from the pons, like we're doing still, and it's the singular nerve, so the nerve that runs by itself. So we can see how these 1 and 2 run together, and then there's this lone one here, 3, and then another lone one here, 4, and we can see how this one here stems from the medulla, so it mustn't be that one, so it must be this one because that's stemming from the pons. It's hard to see, but bear with me. Okay, so that one there must be our facial nerve. Okay, so that is our facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7. Now, moving on from that is the next one, cranial nerve number 8, and that is the vestibular cochlea. And this is the one I said is confusing. And the reason that is because, well, it has 2 branches, as you can see, 1 and 2, because there is vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve, and we refer them to as a collective term, the vestibular cochlea. And both of these nerves, the facial and the vestibular and the cochlear, all run out of the same foramen in the skull, and so that's why they are located very closely together. So they are the 4 stemming from our pons. So we have our trigeminal here, our abducens here, we have our vestibular cochlea highlighted in purple, and our facial there. Okay, now moving on from that, so we have done, let me just zoom out a little. we have done the pons, so we can get rid of that as well. And then moving on from that, we have our last one, and they're the last 4 cranial nerves, and we know that they're going to be stemming somewhere from the medulla. So inferior to the pons is the medulla, located just here, okay? So our next 4, what are they going to be? Well, the first one is going to be the glossopharyngeal. Okay, and the glossopharyngeal, again, is in that same little junction where our other ones are, just located in between the pons and the medulla. So just again, if we were to see our nerve here, vestibulocochlear, and our nerve here, the facial, and then we have this one branching off a little further down, and this then, and because it's stemming from the medulla, as you can see there, this must then be our glossopharyngeal nerve. If I can click on it, there we go, our glossopharyngeal nerve. So cranial nerve number 9. So that is our first nerve coming from the medulla. So where are the other 3? Well, we kind of just work our way down inferior, right? So coming after that, we have our next one, which will be cranial nerve number 10, and that is the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is quite prominent in that it goes all the way down and innervates a lot of our visceral organs. Okay, so that there will be our vagus nerve, very simply, okay? Now, moving on from that, we have 2 more left. So we have the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, and now we have the accessory, or the spinal accessory, which is cranial nerve number 11, and we also have cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal. So which one is which? Well, number 11 is the spinal accessory, and it kind of is in the name, spinal accessory. So whereabouts, or which cranial nerve is going to be directly attached to the spinal cord? Well, there's only really one, and we can see that there on this side, 1 and 2 on that side, and we can see very clearly how it does form this connection with the spinal cord, and so we can refer that to very easily as the spinal accessory, or cranial nerve number 11. Okay, and then moving on from that, we have our last one, which will be cranial nerve number 12. And whereabouts is that located? Well, we know it's still going to be on the medulla, because we're still basing this off this 2x2x4x4 rule. So it is the last one, so it's going to be on here. And the hypoglossal nerve, so cranial nerve number 12, is actually quite easy to identify because it is located very medially to the medulla. So where is it going to be? 1 and 2, the hypoglossal nerve. Okay, so they are our cranial nerves of the brain. So just to do a very quick recap of that, if I can move this properly. We will just do this very quickly. So we have cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory, cranial nerve number 2, the optic, cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor, cranial nerve number 4, the trochlear, cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal, 1 and 2, cranial nerve number 6, the abducens, cranial nerve number 7, the facial, cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear, those 2 running together, you can see it better there, cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve number 10, the vagus, cranial nerve number 11, the spinal accessory, and cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal. I hope that helped, guys. Thank you.